If you've never opened Photoshop before to paint digitally, then this video should have you covered. I'm going to go over some basic navigation tools, layer creation, brushes, brush settings, brush creation, layer management, blending modes, and a whole bunch of other useful tips and tricks along the way. So if you're a complete noob, this is the video for you. If you've used Photoshop before, stick around. You might just pick up a tip or two that you may not have known about. Let's get stuck in. So I thought it'd be good to give ourselves a little project to work on so that you have an end goal to apply the tools that I'll be teaching you. So we're going to be painting kind of a stylized version of a mossy rock. And if you're already familiar with basic brush settings, layer creation, file navigation, you can skip ahead to the next chapter. But do remember again that in each portion of this video, I will be covering a few little tips and tricks that you may not have seen before. Well, first of all, we'll do a quick rundown of the basic tools that we'll be using. So we'll be using the brush tool, which is B, the move tool, which is V, the zoom tool, which is Z, spacebar, which is the grab tool. We'll be using F to cycle through view modes. So F for full screen, F for full screen with no UI, and F to get back to the normal mode. B for brush to get into the brush tool. You'll want to right click to get into the different brushes. It should be noted that for this demo, you'll also want to have some kind of pen tablet installed. So I'm using a Wacom Intuos 4 medium. It's quite an old tablet at this point, and my basic setup is pretty simple. If I go into my Wacom tablet properties, hit grip pen in Photoshop, I've just customized this top button to be right click and this bottom button to be a keystroke, Control Z. So I can make some marks and just tap that button and undo, or I can hit right click to open up the brush menu. So let's talk about layers for a moment. I can hit this little plus icon to add a new layer. I can hit B for brush and draw something, hit the move tool, move that layer around. I can hit plus again, B for brush tool, draw something else, hit V for move that separate layer around. Another thing on layer management and selection is if I hold Alt and at left or right bracket key next to the return key on your keyboard, I can cycle between the different layers. If I have this layer 6 selected and I press Control and the left and right bracket key, I can move that layer up and down the stack. If I hit Control Shift and left and right bracket key, I can move it up and down to the top or bottom of the stack. I can hit Control E to merge layers. So now these are joined together. I can hit Delete to delete the layer. While we're on the topic of using the Move tool, let's make 2 layers here. If I have the Move tool selected, I'm going to move whichever layer is currently selected. If I hold Control with this tool active and click on the occupied pixels of a different layer, I will select that layer. So that's a really quick way to control click the layer, move it, control click a different layer and move it. I can press Z for the zoom tool and go out with the minus. And if I hold Alt, I can reverse that. I like to have scrubby zoom turned on, where I can click and drag on my tablet and just go in and out like this. I'll hit F for full screen. Now that we're navigating around, if I hold down spacebar, I can navigate that way. If you prefer a different mode of navigation where you like to zoom in and get across the canvas quickly, you can hit Control K for preferences, go into Tools and enable Flick Panning. That's going to allow you to flick the stylus onto the tablet and it will kind of drift along, and if I touch my stylus on the tablet, I'll stop it from moving. So that's a matter of preference. I don't mind either, but whichever you prefer, you can set it up with flick panning. So let's get started and make some custom brushes while we figure out how we're going to paint a stylized version of a mossy rock. So I'll delete these, I'll Control E to merge the top layer with the layer underneath. And let's make a new layer here. So by default, we're looking at these default brushes here. Let's make our first custom brush. So firstly, for brush sizing, those same brackets next to the return key can be used to size up and down. But if I hold Alt and right click, which in this case I've bound to that upper button on my stylus, I can actually drag this up and down to resize it really quickly on the fly. If this isn't working for you, you might have to hit Control K and go into Preferences, go down to Performance and check Use Graphics Processor. So now we can resize the brush. I'm going to paint in some rocky shapes. So the first thing I want to fix in the brush that I'm creating is I want to be able to put down some more angular marks. So I'm going to hit E for the eraser tool. I'm going to select the default round brush, use Alt, right click and drag on my stylus, and we're just going to cut away the edges of this to make it a little bit more angular and irregular. There we go. Now what I'm going to do is control click on the layer thumbnail. This will make a selection of the layer itself. I can go edit, define brush preset, and I'll hit OK for now. And you'll see the UI has changed. I'm going to hit Control D to deselect, and let's make a new layer and let's test it out. So firstly, I'm just going to resize, and I did have the eraser tool selected. So it's actually the eraser set to that shape, but with pressing B and the brush tool selected, I'll just have to right click and I can find my new brush here. So now my brush is selected, I can paint with that. But how is that going to help me draw rocks? Well, if we go to Window and Brush Settings, which by default is F5, I can start editing this brush. Let's change the spacing. I'm going to get some chunky vibes here. So the first thing let's look at is shape dynamics. This is going to affect the shape of how each stamp of this brush appears. So let's introduce some size jitter. You can see a live preview of that. I can add pen pressure as an influence on the size. So if I press gently, it's small. If I press firmly, it's slightly larger. I'm going to up the minimum diameter there. And I'm also going to introduce a little bit of angle jitter. So now when I paint something like this, it's automatically starting to give me some nice rock silhouettes. I'll tweak the roundness jitter as well. And we'll go flip X and flip Y. And that's going to introduce a little bit more randomness as well. So there we go. This is our first rock brush, great for painting in silhouettes. So what I'm going to do now is hit this little plus icon and we'll go Rocky Brush 1. So let's use that to block out some rock shapes that I like. Okay, clear this layer, select the new one, and just looking at some of these references, I'm just going to block this in. And even with the eraser tool selected, I can select that new brush and cut away from that shape as well. Get some size variation. And there we go. That's some kind of general rocky shape that I'm happy with. I might make this slightly bigger. So let's hit Control T. And I'm just going to drag out this corner. I'm going to hold Shift so that it respects the proportions. And I'll hit Enter. V for Move Tool. Recenter that. B for brush, and let's make another brush. So I want to be able to color in this silhouette that I've made. So I'm going to hit this little icon here to lock transparency, or the shortcut would be the question mark key. If for some reason that turns on lock layer, you'll just want to manually press this lock transparency button, and that will revert it back to turning the lock transparency on and off. So I'm going to lock the transparency, and while I have the brush tool selected, I can press and hold the Alt key, and that's going to bring up the eyedropper. And I can just pick, let's see, a rocky color here. And if I release Alt, it'll go back to the brush tool. If I press I, that's going to toggle the eyedropper tool. So you can choose what area you want to sample and which layers. By default, it should be set to all layers, and point sample, you want to set to something that's your preference. And at the moment, this is just painting. I'm going to Alt click to keep picking colors. It's just painting those shapes, but I want to introduce a little bit more interest. So we'll go back into our brush settings, and I'd like to draw your attention to this color dynamics tab here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull up the hue, saturation, and brightness jitter, and I'll make a new layer, and I'll show you what that's doing. It's just introducing some variation here. It's a great way even just to paint random rocks, but for my purposes, filling out this interior silhouette here is what I'm after. So I'd also like to introduce some transfer, and on a new layer, what transfer does is changes the opacity and flow. So if both of these are set to pen pressure, I can press harder for more opacity, and I can press more lightly for less opacity. So that combined with the color jitter means that I'm going to start to get some pretty interesting random happy accidents. So back on my main layer here, I can select some light colors and just drift over sort of the top sides of these rocks here. Pick some darker colors, drift over the bottom parts, and I'm just sort of seeing what happy accidents happen, very Bob Ross style. But I'm letting the randomness of the brush I've created kind of create these happy accidents for me. I might get slightly darker hues in here. And I might drift over one of these areas with a light touch to establish a medium value, and then I can color pick that medium value. So there we go. Zooming back, sort of starting to get this impressionistic, painterly rock feeling object here. And before I go any further, let's make sure I save a brush that has these settings applied. So we'll go plus again, and we'll go rocky coloring brush. So next step, I want to do a similar thing for the moss. And what I really want to capture in this moss is, we'll go back to the round brush, make a new layer. I want to capture the blobbiness of the moss. And then I want to capture some of the texture of the moss too. So how will I do that? Well, hard round brush. I'm just going to paint some kind of blobby shape. Let's say it's something like that. I'm going to paint it a little bit bigger, just so when I save out the brush, it has a little bit more resolution. Let's do the same thing. Control click the thumbnail, edit, define brush preset. We'll go moss base. Control D to deselect, and on a new layer, let's start fine tuning it, same as before. So same thing again, introducing some size jitter, make it pen pressure dependent with a minimum diameter. We'll get some angle jitter. I'll slide this up a bit more, and some roundness jitter. And already I'm getting this kind of blobby effect where maybe I can come in and my strokes just have that mossy quality about them already. So flip X, flip Y, and same thing. We now have a blocking out brush for our moss. Now I'm going to select that new mossy brush in my erase tool as well, and I can really carve out some shapes here. So important thing to point out is that I'm painting this moss on its own layer so that I have full control over the shape of that without having to worry about what I've already established. So you can see pretty quickly how easy it is to develop shapes and to paint in the impression of certain things just by using simple tools and carving those shapes, pushing and pulling with the brush and the eraser tool. And this was a real game changer moment for me in my digital painting journey, when I realized I could really separate the process. I didn't have to render the lighting and the texture and the shading all at once. I could break the process up into steps, and generally the steps I like to follow these days is shapes first, form information second, so lighting and values that tell the viewer something about the form in 3D space, and then texture at the very end. Happily, some of those rock block out sections already have a little bit of texture information just because of the angularity of the brush that we created. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to lock that layer, and let's pull up my brush settings now and make a tool that's going to help us add some lighting and texture information to this. So I'll check on color dynamics. Now let's just bring in a new layer and we can test the stroke. So here's the color dynamics. I'm going to select like a yellowish green for this part. So the first thing I want to introduce is just a little bit more spacing, and let's go to transfer. I might pull up the minimum diameters for both of these just to make it easier on my hand. I don't have to press too hard on the tablet. And I'm going to check on scattering just to introduce a little bit of variation in the placement of that. And what I'm going for here is that kind of speckled feeling, especially in some of these patches here. Let's test it out now. I'll hit V and control click on that moss to make sure it's selected. Make sure transparency is locked, and then I can just start painting. I'll paint on the top side to give it some lighting and texture at the same time. So one of the really nice things about creating your own custom brushes as you're working on a project is it means that you can be in full control of the style, and it gives you that shape language for free. So a nice trick I learnt from a guy called Kalen Chock, who's now a VizDev artist at DreamWorks Animation. But back in the day, he showed me this cool color trick that I'll share with you now, and that is, let's open the color window, and instead of some of these default settings like hue, saturation, or brightness, If you go over to these lab settings, I like to use A. When I have this green selected, it gives me a little bit of options in terms of picking colors that have like a hue shift to them. So in these directions, it can go between like a more yellow, warmer color or a cooler color. You can also move this slider on the side as well. So it gives you a lot of cool options. So picking this green here, we're going to A, and then I'm just going to pull it up into that sort of warm, sort of hot yellow. Now you can see as I'm painting that in, it gives that real impression of being hit by sunlight. It's got a bit of that subsurface scattering that plants and moss tends to have. So finally, I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm just going to hit Control and left bracket so I can shove that layer underneath the moss. And I'm just going to come in here, select my moss color. I'm going to use that same coloring in brush just to finesse the edges of those shapes. Again, using the erase tool to get rid of parts that I don't really like, but this is really going to help this moss sort of integrate with the rocks. So if I like that, I can shift click on the layer above and hit Control E to merge. I'll lock that, and then I can continue painting. So I might do the same thing for the shadows. I'll grab this color, I'll go into lab mode, I'm going to bring it down and to the left, and we'll introduce a little bit of coolness. That might have been a bit too far, so I'll color pick again, and I'll just go straight down, very ever so slightly to the left this time. And I'll just hit the bottom side of this moss to get the shadow side in place. And once I've established these colors, I can color pick those areas and make sure they're nicely integrated. So going back to the rock now, and this time I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to hold Alt while I hover between these layers, and that's going to clip that onto the layer underneath. So it's similar to lock transparency, except now if I go back to my rocky brush, if I paint something and use the move tool, you can see I can drag that around anywhere I want. The reason I'd use something like this is if I wanted to paint inside this rock that I've made, but I want to make very specific marks where I can cut shapes in, erase shapes out, and really curate where I want the marks to be. So I'm coming in here and just carving shapes in and out. I'm kind of trying to establish some cuts in the rock or some crevices, maybe even some highlights. This is another great technique, just having it on a separate clipped layer, because you can kind of trial some shapes or some textures that you want to add, and you don't have to be afraid of making any mistakes, right? Because it's all in its own layer. So new layer again, and let's go back to default round brush for a second. So I want to introduce some diffuse shadows or ambient occlusion to these rocks, just to separate them a little bit from each other. So I'll choose like a dark value down here, maybe go a bit darker, something like that. And I'm just going to carve out what I want the edge of that to look like, something like this. Then once I have that shape painted in, I can just hit one of these soft round brushes. I'll just erase away one side of it. So same thing over here. Could even use the hard round brush just to have a bit of precise control over that edge. And let's erase away. And you can do this as many times as you want and with as many different brushes as you want. So I've got some softness there. I can come back in with the eraser tool and a hard brush or with the rocky brush and introduce a little bit of texture to that soft transition. And I'm just adding layers now as needed, carving out specific shapes using very simple brushes. So another level of control you can have is if you hit this little rectangle with a circle in it, it's going to add a layer mask over this rocky layer here. And I'm going to press D with the brush tool selected to reset my values to black and white. If I have this layer mask selected, basically when I paint in black, it's going to erase. If I press X to flip the colors and I paint in pure white, it's going to add back in. And this gives me another layer of non-destructive fine control over the shapes to where I can just keep pressing X, carve in and out, fine-tune some of these shapes. Another useful tip as well is if I click and then hold Shift and click somewhere else or tap somewhere else on the tablet, it's just going to create a line between those two click points. So Shift tapping Good way to draw straight lines. And let's make a brush for some foliage. So for the foliage, you guessed it, by now it's about finding the kind of shapes that you want to create, making a stamp, and then playing with brush settings. I'm going to make a single blob. That looks good to me. Select that, define brush preset, deselect, and then we'll start playing around with this brush. So I'll select a leafy color, and then we'll just play with brush settings again. I'm going to introduce some direction to my control as well. So with that off, drawing around like that, everything's going to be aligned, but with direction control set to direction, it's going to match whatever direction I do. So you can see it's now following around, and that just allows me to paint leaves facing different directions. So built into this, I do want this to be hard, round, so that I can establish a nice silhouette, but I'm going to turn on color dynamics for this one. Let's see what that looks like. Quite nice. Lower the size and we'll start testing this. So let's put this in a layer on the very top. Might choose a slightly brighter color and we'll bring the brush down in size even more. I'm using the bracket keys again now for fine control. So that's a pretty quick way of adding in some little plants. So I might save that and I'll quickly time lapse through another version that you could make. So here it is, mini plant just with a little stem. One thing to note about any brush with a distinctive shape is that brushing from left to right with angle jitter and control set to direction will give you this result, but from right to left, it will flip it upside down. So we're filling this in. Let's add maybe a different variety. Go new layer. Maybe we'll change the size and just dab that in little clumps. So same brush, but it feels like a different plant just because of how I'm using it and the colors that I've chosen. And again, V for move tool, control click on this mossy brush, question mark to lock transparency. And I can always come back with one of these mossy brushes and let's select a cooler color for the shadows, just for anything that I think might be occluded by the rocks here. So new layer, let's get some soft mossy brush. Pick one of these mid greens here, and I'm just going to use that mossy brush to block in maybe some grass shapes. I'm going to use control and brackets to place that layer where I want it. And again, just focusing on shape at the moment. I can always go back and turn on color dynamics as well if I want to block out the shapes and introduce some of those dynamics at the same time. And for this one, I'm just carving in some shapes that work with these rocks. So might have some grass growing up here, then have this rock cut back into it. So same thing as before, lock the layer, pick a cooler color for some shadows. Let's make sure I have transfer selected on this one. And let's go for like a deep, darker shadow color there. So now I've established where those cast shadows are. It's a little bit easier to go back to these other layers, control clicking on them, picking a dark color and making sure those shadows match. I do want to make sure they're slightly different so I can still pick out those plants. So another lighting trick, this is a great example of a different kind of non-destructive approach to painting, is let's say I have these plants here and they're all colored in the exact same color. Let's drag them up to make sure they're in the right spots. I'll hit M and select this and hit V to move it, Control D, deselect. Let's make a new layer and let's change the blending mode to multiply. Hold Alt to clip it, and I'm just going to select sort of like a blue-gray color here. What that's going to do is it's going to make it really easy for me to paint in some shadows. So let's choose maybe something a bit lighter, maybe a bit less colored and a bit more neutral. And you can think of this as like a non-destructive shadow layer. So that's really handy for painting shadows. If your scene is already covered in shadow, what you might prefer to do is paint in the light. So adding a new layer here, clipping it, setting it to color dodge, double clicking on the layer and unchecking transparency shapes layer generally is the best tool for color dodge. And instead I'm just going to pick a warm yellow, and that's going to allow me to paint in some sunlight. So I can tweak the colors there. This blending mode is one of my favorites for lighting. So it just depends what value your underlying layers are already at. And I can hit the eraser tool and erase out, the stems. So maybe the stems underneath those pads are in shadow. And last fun little trick here is I'm just going to click on this layer and shift click, Control E to merge. So I've got these plants, and if I shift click, I've got these plants as well. So I'm going to shift click those two and hit merge. And then a nice trick is if I hold Alt and I click on this layer and drag it underneath, that's going to make a duplicate. And if I lock this layer, choose a gray and just fill that in, if I move that, you can see it's just created this gray layer here. If I drag that down slightly, I set that to multiply, it's going to give this impression of these plants casting a shadow. And if that effect is a bit too intense, I can always just bring this value up a little bit to soften it. An alternative can also be, instead of multiply, setting this to darken and picking an existing shadow color. So something like this, maybe even using one of these brushes. And now we're using that shape we've established to paint just in those shadow shapes. So putting transfer on so I can have some fine control. But it just adds to that sense of realism, even though this is a stylized painting. So lastly, just introducing some final bit of texture and sticking with a stylized theme. I'll just time-lapse through making a grass brush, another classic. So there you go. I made sure I took the time to find a grass shape that I thought would fit with this art style. There's definitely more realistic grass shapes you could make, but you can see just with a few tweaks, I'm able to set that up. And another thing to note about using brushes like these is that anytime you have a transition between light and dark, you can really sell the texture of something. So I'm just dabbing this in areas, especially near the silhouette, where it's really going to sell what it's made of. Just making sure I've got direction on this so that when I come into these areas, I can change which way it's facing. And I can even use that to select this bottom layer and erase out of it, just to give that sort of impression, that give an indication of what the surrounding environment is. So finally, maybe as a bonus, if I click on the bottommost layer and the topmost layer and hit Control G, I'm going to add those layers to their own group. What I can actually do now is clip a layer to the whole group, and let's set that to something like multiply. Again, I'll choose like a neutral light gray. I kind of just grab a soft round brush and introduce or indicate maybe a little bit of like a pool of light by painting in some soft shadows. This layer here, what's actually happened is I've been erasing into a layer where the transparency is locked, which actually paints in white. So you want to uncheck that to avoid that if possible. But what I'm going to do to avoid that is just double click on this, and I'm going to slide down this current layer blend if slider. That's just going to remove the white. If I hold Alt and then click that again, I can drag it a little bit more just to soften that transition. To apply that, let's make a new layer above it, select both layers and Control E to merge. And now my new layer has that white removed. So if I like the shape of that, but I want to increase the intensity, I'll hit Control U to bring up this adjustment layer, and I can tweak that to my liking. Maybe increase that saturation of that blue. And we could do the same trick as we did before with our color dodge layer. And just hit that top side. I can use that trick as well that I just showed you about blend if. We'll double click on this. And instead of the current layer, I want to edit the underlying layer. So if I want some of the darkness to peek through from the underlying layers, I'll just pull this up. You can see it gradually introduces that. So it's a great way of adding some lighting but reintroducing the shadows that you'd already established. And again, holding Alt to split that, and then I can tweak the value range. Might just grab this opacity word here and play with that just to tweak the intensity. So there you go. I hope this was useful for you. And yeah, go and paint some mossy rocks or whatever else floats your boat, and have fun with it. I'm not going to share this as a brush pack or anything. I want you to go out and make your own brushes that suit your own needs. Good luck.